Okay. So since the 80s, so for like 3 decades, professionals have really been working to define what we're talking about. So the emotional impact of doing the work that we do. And there are a lot of terms out there, and honestly, I think it can be a bit confusing. So I like to use this diagram, which might look familiar to some folks. It's from the Professional Quality of Life, or ProQOL measure, and that is the most commonly used tool or measure to assess the impact of this work on helping professionals, and it includes these different subscales of compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress. And so we'll spend some time talking a little bit about what these are and the definitions and what they look like and why we're parsing them out this way as well. I'm a visual person, and that might have been helpful for you. Just an additional way to kind of understand those different definitions, right? These are all reactions to stress. If we just take away compassion satisfaction, but vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, burnout, these are all stress reactions, right? And so I think it can still be a little confusing. So I like to think of it in these two buckets. We can have that organizational stress, which is what we think of as burnout. So this kind of stress is that workplace stress. So my commute to work, the paperwork, the time crunches, my salary isn't what I want it to be. My workplace culture isn't great. I don't really like my supervisor. These are the stressors that come from working in the climate that you work in. Yes, paperwork is real. So that's a real stressor. So these, we can get that when we hear burnout, we're thinking about it as kind of an organizational stress. Then we also have this interpersonal stress, which is really the emotional impact of working with children and families exposed to trauma. So I think of compassion fatigue as more of that broader term. It's this broader impact that we have of working in and around trauma. So that cognitive, physical, emotional, behavioral impact of working in this field. And then from compassion fatigue, we can develop secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, which we think of as a kind of more severe, looking a little bit more like PTSD. So I hope that's helpful in kind of thinking about the different types of stressors. And we separate them because the way we respond to them is going to be different. So it's really helpful to reflect on what kind of stress am I feeling, right? If the majority of my stress is around my workplace climate and culture, around the amount of paperwork, those things, the drive to work, the difficult relationships with my colleagues, toxic meetings, those kinds of things, if that's the majority of your stress, then the way you respond to that is going to be different than if your stress response is loss of empathy for clients, hopelessness, nightmares, right? And so we want to separate those. However, we also know that they're interrelated. So you can imagine that if you have a high level of burnout because you work in maybe an environment that isn't as psychologically safe or healthy, the reality is that you're more vulnerable then to incur compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. So we think of them as kind of separate stressors, but they also are interrelated.